The universe operates on principles even the most advanced civilizations struggle to fully comprehend. The ancients built the Stargate network across 2 galaxies and spent millions of years mapping the fundamental architecture of existence, energy, matter, time, the precise mathematical language underlying every physical law. They catalogued everything. They named everything. They believed, with the quiet certainty of beings who had touched the face of creation, that they understood the shape of what was real. They never catalogued death. Not because they missed it. Not because their instruments were insufficient or their mathematics incomplete. But because death was not a phenomenon to be catalogued. It was the condition under which all cataloging occurred, the silent, absolute context within which every act of understanding took place. It did not exist within the universe's operating principles. It was older than the principles themselves. Stargate Command, Cheyenne Mountain, Colorado. 0347 hours. The gate room was empty except for Sergeant Chen at the monitoring station, running his 3rd consecutive overnight shift on a week that had been, by SGC standards, refreshingly uneventful. No off-world activation. No incoming wormhole. No crisis requiring the immediate assembly of 4 people who had collectively survived more unsurvivable situations than any other team in the program's history. The Stargate activated itself. No alarm. No incoming wormhole alert. No chevrons encoding in sequence the way they always did, the slow, deliberate rotation of the ring, each chevron locking with the particular sound that SGC personnel heard in their sleep. Instead, all 9 chevrons lit simultaneously, without rotation, without encoding, without any signal from any known dialing computer in 2 galaxies. The event horizon formed in complete silence, no kawoosh, no outward surge of unstable vortex. Just a surface of impossible stillness, like Mercury that had decided to be vertical. Sergeant Chen stared at it for 4 seconds before reaching for the alarm. The iris did not close. Not because the mechanism failed. The iris responded perfectly to his command, the trinium-titanium alloy rotating into position with its standard precision. It closed completely. Chen watched the indicator confirm full closure and felt the specific relief of a man whose training had provided him an appropriate response to an inappropriate situation. The event horizon passed through the closed iris as though the iris did not exist. Not through it. Not around it. Through it, the same way light passed through glass, the same way a concept passed through a wall. The iris remained physically intact, sensors confirmed its closure, and whatever came through the gate arrived in the gate room anyway, because the iris was a physical object and what was arriving was not. The wormhole disengaged 30 seconds later. All 9 chevrons went dark simultaneously. The gate room was empty. Chen's report, filed at 0349, described an anomalous gate activation of unknown origin, duration 30 seconds, with no detectable traveler, no energy discharge, and no physical evidence of anything having come through. He noted that the iris had functioned correctly throughout. He noted that his instruments detected nothing in the gate room following the event. He did not note the feeling. Because feelings were not part of standard incident reports, that the room was different after the gate went dark. Not colder. Not darker. Not measurably altered in any way that his instruments could confirm. Just different. The way a room was different after something had been added to it that you couldn't see. General Hammond reviewed the report at 0600 and called an 0800 briefing. By 0800, 3 members of the SGC's support staff were dead. The first was a technician named Kowalski. No relation to the Kowalski who had been lost in the programs. Early days, a coincidence that nobody remarked on and everyone noticed. He died at 0521 in the equipment storage corridor on sublevel 18, when a shelving unit that had been bolted to the wall for 11 years came free at precisely the moment he was walking beneath it. The investigation would later confirm that the bolts had not failed, they had been removed, cleanly, without tool marks, without anyone in the corridor at the time. The shelving unit had simply ceased to be attached to the wall. The second was a linguist named Dr. Abra, found at 0614 in her office, the apparent victim of an electrical fault in her workstation. That surge protection, correctly functioning circuit breakers, and 2 independent failsafe systems had all somehow failed to prevent simultaneously. The third was a gate technician named Sayers who at 0743, 17 minutes before the briefing, walked into the men's restroom on level 11 and did not walk out. The cause of death would take the infirmary 4 hours to determine and would eventually be logged as cardiac arrest in a 29-year-old man with no cardiac history and a clean bill of health from his physical 3 weeks prior. 3 deaths. 3 different causes. 3 different locations. 3 different times. One thing in common, that nobody had identified yet, all 3 had been in the gate room at 0347. All 3 had been present when the wormhole activated itself and deposited something into Stargate command that every instrument in the mountain confirmed was not there. If you want to see more crossovers that challenge the foundations of the Stargate universe, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character or force you'd want to see come through the gate in the comments below. Live long and prosper. Colonel Jack O'Neill arrived at the 0800 briefing 40 seconds late with coffee, took one look at Hammond's expression, and sat down without making a single remark about the hour. After 8 years in this program, he had developed a reliable instinct for the specific quality of bad news that required him to be quiet first and difficult later. Daniel Jackson was already at the table with 3 folders open, his pen moving with the focused energy of a man who had found something that bothered him and was responding by finding out everything about it. Samantha Carter had her laptop open, her expression the particular combination of engaged and troubled that meant she had a theory she hadn't finished being alarmed by yet. Teal'c sat with the stillness of a former First Prime who had learned that patience was not the absence of readiness but its fullest expression. Hammond set down the incident report. 3 of our people are dead, he said. As of 45 minutes ago, we don't know why. What we do know is that something came through that gate at 0347 this morning. He looked at each of them in turn. I want to know what it was. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Carter looked up from her laptop, and the expression on her face was one O'Neill had learned to take very seriously, the look she wore when her mathematics had arrived somewhere she genuinely hadn't expected to go. Sir, she said carefully, I don't think the question is what it was. She paused. I think the question is who it came for. Carter's theory took 40 minutes to present and approximately 4 seconds to land. She had been working since 0415, when the second death had come through on the infirmary report and something in the pattern had caught the part of her brain that never fully went off duty. The part that processed incoming data against existing models even when she was technically doing something else, the part that had once calculated an escape trajectory from a collapsing solar system while simultaneously maintaining a conversation about Minnesota fishing. That part had looked at 2 deaths in 90 minutes inside a secure military facility and said, quietly but insistently, this is a sequence, not a coincidence. By the time Sayers was found in the restroom on level 11, she had the common variable. All 3 were in the gate room at 0347, she said, pulling up the security footage on the briefing room's display. The timestamp showed the empty gate room, the silent activation, the event horizon forming without sound or surge. Kowalski was running a diagnostic on the DHD interface. Abra was collecting translation files she'd left on the monitoring station. Sayers was finishing his shift. She advanced the footage to the moment the event horizon formed. All 3 were present for approximately 20 to 25 seconds of the activation before the alert brought additional personnel in. By that point, whatever came through had already, she stopped. Chose a different word. Had already identified them. Identified them for what? O'Neill asked. Carter pulled up a second display, 3 incident reports, 3 sets of circumstantial data, 3 cause of death summaries. For correction, she said. General, I've been running probability analysis on the accident conditions for each death. The shelving unit in the storage corridor, the probability of all 4 bolts failing simultaneously, accounting for material fatigue, load stress, and vibration. Patterns from the mountain systems, is approximately 1 in 4.7 million. The electrical fault in Abra's workstation defeating 5 independent safety systems simultaneously is 1 in 12 million. Sayer's cardiac event, given his health profile and age, is 1 in approximately 800,000. She looked around the table. These events are not impossible. But the probability of all 3 occurring in the same facility within 3 hours of an anomalous gate activation, affecting the only 3 people present at that activation, is a number I'd need a second screen to display. Daniel had been quiet through most of this, which for Daniel meant he was thinking hard about something that connected to something else and hadn't finished connecting it yet. He looked up from his folders. There's a concept, he said slowly, across multiple Earth mythologies and several cultures we've encountered through the gate. The idea of death as an active force, not an event, not a biological process, but a sentient or semi-sentient principle that maintains a specific order. That has a design. He looked at Carter. In Final Destination mythology, and I'm using that term loosely, it appears in several independent folkloric traditions with remarkable consistency. When someone escapes their appointed death, the force doesn't accept the disruption. It follows. It corrects. It collects what's owed, Carter said quietly. Yes. O'Neill set down his coffee. Daniel. Are you telling me that death itself came through our gate last night and is now working its way through a to-do list somewhere in my mountain? I'm saying the pattern fits a model that multiple cultures across Earth and possibly beyond have independently described, Daniel said, with the careful precision of a man who had learned that the universe's tendency to validate ancient mythology was something he needed to present in measured doses. I'm also saying that if that model is accurate, the 3 people who died this morning were not random. They were first, Teal'c said. Everyone looked at him. In the accounts Daniel Jackson describes, Teal'c continued, with the deliberate calm of a man who had served a false god for a century and had therefore developed a very high threshold for cosmological alarm, those who escaped death's design are pursued in a specific sequence. Those who died this morning were not the primary targets. His dark eyes moved around the table with the assessment of someone who had done threat analysis in environments considerably more immediately lethal than a briefing room. They were the beginning of the sequence. The primary targets are those whose survival has most significantly disrupted the natural order. The briefing room was quiet. O'Neill looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at Carter. Carter looked at her laptop with the expression of someone whose mathematics had just confirmed something she had been hoping it wouldn't. How many times have we cheated death? O'Neill asked. Not rhetorically. Actually asking. Daniel opened the middle folder. I started a rough count at 0600, he said. I had to stop at 17 because the briefing was starting and I hadn't finished the missions from 1999. He paused. That's just SG-1. If we're talking about everyone in this facility who has survived something statistically unsurvivable through gate travel. How many people in this mountain, Carter? O'Neill said. Carter pulled up the personnel manifest. Ran the calculation she had already run once and had been hoping not to have to say out loud. Approximately 230 personnel have survived at least one incident through the Stargate program that probability analysis would classify as unsurvivable, she said. Of those, 47 have survived 3 or more such incidents. She looked at O'Neill steadily. SG-1 has survived 19 confirmed unsurvivable incidents as a team, not counting individual instances. 19, O'Neill repeated. That I've documented so far, Daniel said, with the apologetic tone of a man delivering a number he knew was going to get worse. Hammond had been listening with the expression of a man who had commanded Stargate Command through System Lord invasions, Replicator incursions, and the near destruction of Earth on multiple occasions, and who had developed accordingly a very specific kind of command composure. The ability to receive information that would reduce most people to paralysis and immediately begin organizing a response. He looked at Carter. Can we detect it? Whatever came through that gate? No, sir, Carter said. Every instrument we have is designed to detect matter or energy. Whatever this is, she pulled up the gate room sensor logs from 0347, showing readings that were completely, perfectly, impossibly normal throughout the entire activation. It doesn't appear to be either. Or if it is, it's operating at a level our instruments weren't designed to measure. Can we send it back? I don't know how to address something we can't detect, locate, or interact with physically, Carter said. What I can do is try to understand its operating principles well enough to. She stopped. Looked at Daniel. The mythology. The folklore. In the accounts you found, is there any record of anyone successfully stopping it? Daniel was quiet for a moment. No, he said. But there are accounts of people who figured out the sequence. He looked up. Who figured out whose name came next? And used that knowledge to. He paused again, choosing his words with the care of a linguist who understood that precision mattered here more than anywhere. Not to stop it, but to face it on their own terms rather than its terms. O'Neill looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Hammond. Sir, he said, I think we need to figure out whose name is at the top of this list. He already knew. He could feel it the way he felt incoming fire, not through any instrument or calculation, but through the specific instinct of someone who had been surviving unsurvivable things for long enough that his nervous system had developed a dedicated channel for exactly this kind of information. The name at the top of the list was his. Daniel's full count reached 23 by 1100 hours. He had gone back through every mission report SG-1 had filed since the program's inception, cross-referencing incident classifications with medical records, after-action reports, and the specific category of documentation that Hammond's predecessor had labeled anomalous survival events, a bureaucratic euphemism for should be dead, isn't, unclear why. 23 times, by conservative count, the 4 members of SG-1 had encountered situations that the mathematics of survival said they should not have walked away from. 23 moments where something had reached for them and missed, or been interrupted, or been denied by a combination of extraordinary skill, improbable luck, and the particular stubborn refusal to accept a lethal outcome that had become SG-1's most consistent tactical characteristic. 23 disruptions to a design that had apparently been keeping records. O'Neill sat in Hammond's office at 11:30 and looked at the number on the page and said nothing for a long time. You knew, Hammond said. It wasn't an accusation. It was the observation of a man who had been reading Jack O'Neill for 8 years and had learned to distinguish between the silences that meant he was processing and the silences that meant he had already arrived somewhere and was deciding whether to share the address. I had a feeling, O'Neill said. Since when? Since about 30 seconds into Carter's briefing. He set the folder down. Sir, I've been in situations I shouldn't have survived since I was 22 years old. Special ops, black operations, missions that didn't officially happen in countries that officially didn't have us there. I've always just, he paused, searching for the right word with the expression of a man who didn't usually search for words because he preferred to operate in the territory where words weren't required. Walked away. Every time. Even when walking away was the part that made the least sense. And now something is here to explain why, Hammond said. Something is here to correct the accounting, O'Neill said. Which is a different thing. Hammond was quiet for a moment. Outside the office window, the gate room sat silent and normal, the Stargate cold and dark and giving absolutely no indication that it had let something through its event horizon at 0347 that had since killed 3 people and was working its way through a list that had Jack O'Neill's name somewhere near the top. I'm not losing you, Jack, Hammond said, in the voice he used when he was speaking as George rather than as General. The voice that appeared rarely and carried more weight for its rarity. George, O'Neill said, which he almost never said either, I don't think this is something you can put a security detail on. 2 levels below, in the main lab, Carter had dismantled and rebuilt her approach to the problem 3 times in 2 hours. The first approach, attempting to detect the force through its effects rather than directly, the way you located a black hole by watching what happened to the space around it, had generated interesting data and no actionable intelligence. The second approach, modeling the probability cascades that preceded each death, trying to identify the next event before it occurred, had given her a window of approximately 4 minutes between the moment the chain of causality began assembling itself and the moment it became irreversible. 4 minutes was not enough time to evacuate a mountain. The third approach was the one she hadn't wanted to pursue because it required accepting a premise that everything in her scientific training resisted, that what they were dealing with was not a phenomenon but a presence. Not a force that operated according to discoverable laws but an active intelligence that selected, planned, and executed with something that functioned, however alien its nature, like intent. If it had intent, it could potentially be communicated with. She was still trying to decide if that was a more or less terrifying conclusion than the alternative when Teal'c appeared in the lab doorway. "You have been at this station for 4 hours without pause," he observed. "I'm fine," Carter said, which was the response she gave when she was not fine but the work was more important than the accurate status report. Teal'c entered the lab and stood beside her workstation with the particular quality of presence that he deployed when he intended to remain regardless of what she said. He looked at her screens, the probability cascades, the incident timeline, the personnel manifest with its 230 flagged names, and was quiet in the way that meant he was thinking rather than waiting for her to finish. "Daniel Jackson spoke of a design," he said finally. "A predetermined sequence of deaths that this force seeks to restore." "Yes," Carter said. "In my experience as first prime of Apophis," Teal'c said, "I oversaw the deaths of many individuals. Some by my hand. Some by order. Some as consequence of actions I chose and actions I did not." He paused. "I have survived things that should have killed me. The symbiote has extended my life well beyond what a Jaffa warrior should expect." His voice was even, factual, stripped of anything that might be mistaken for self-pity. "If this force operates on the principle that lives taken before their time create a debt, and lives extended beyond their natural span create a different category of debt." "You're on the list," Carter said quietly. "Teal'c, I know. I've been trying not to say it out loud because saying it out loud makes it real," Teal'c said. "I am familiar with the phenomenon." He looked at her directly. "I have also had longer than most to consider my relationship with death. A century of service to a false god who used the promise of extended life as a chain. 30 years since that chain was broken." He paused. "I do not fear what is on that list, Captain Carter. I am curious about the order." Carter pulled up the incident timeline on her main screen. "If the pattern holds, and I think it does, based on the 3 deaths this morning, the sequence follows the magnitude of the disruption. The larger the deviation from the design, the higher the priority." She highlighted 4 names at the top of her probability model. "Which means the order is approximately, O'Neill, you, Daniel, me. With O'Neill carrying the heaviest debt because he's been doing this the longest and his survival record goes back furthest." "Then we should tell O'Neill," Teal'c said. "He already knows," Carter said. "Yes," Teal'c agreed. "But knowing alone and knowing with his team beside him are different conditions. You are aware of this." She looked at him for a moment. Then she saved her work, closed the probability model, and stood up. "You're right," she said. "Let's go find him." They found him in the gate room. He was standing at the base of the ramp, looking up at the Stargate with his hands in his pockets and the expression he wore when he was having a conversation with himself that he wasn't going to share unless specifically invited. The gate room was empty except for the 2 SF guards at the door, who had learned over years of SGC service that Colonel O'Neill standing alone in the gate room was a situation that required presence but not interruption. Daniel was already there, sitting on the bottom of the ramp with 3 folders and his pen, because Daniel's response to existential crisis was always more research, and because he understood O'Neill well enough to know that company mattered more than conversation in moments like this one. O'Neill heard Carter and Teal'c come in. He didn't turn around. 23, he said. 23 confirmed, Daniel said from the ramp. I found 2 more that are arguable. I'm leaving them off the conservative count. How many people in the mountain right now are ahead of us on this things list? O'Neill asked Carter. None, she said. The 3 who died this morning were the only other personnel present at the gate activation. Their deaths were most recent, the Force cleared them first. She paused. We're next. O'Neill nodded slowly. He was still looking at the Stargate. At the cold, dark ring of it, the alien geometry that had become over 8 years of impossible missions, the closest thing he had to a fixed point of reference in a life that had become almost entirely defined by the absence of fixed points. Here's what I keep coming back to, he said. Whatever came through that gate, it's been here since 0347. 6 hours. It cleared 3 names in 6 hours. He turned around finally, and his expression was the one his team had learned to identify as O'Neill at his most operationally serious, stripped of the deflecting humor, the deliberate casualness, the carefully maintained performance of a man who found everything only mildly concerning. It hasn't come for us yet. No, Carter said. Why not? The question sat in the gate room for a moment. Because it is not finished preparing, Teal'c said. O'Neill looked at him. In battle, Teal'c said, when a warrior faces an opponent they respect, they do not rush. They observe. They prepare. They ensure their approach is sufficient to the target. He met O'Neill's gaze steadily. Whatever this force is, it has encountered us through the gate room's records. Through the evidence of 23 survivals. It knows what we are capable of. A pause. It is deciding how to be certain. The gate room was very quiet. Then O'Neill looked at Carter. Can we use that? The preparation time. And Carter, who had been waiting for exactly that question because it was the right question and O'Neill always eventually asked the right question, said, I think so. But we're going to need help from somewhere this force has never been before. The sarcophagus on P3X882 had been resurrecting Ball for 63 years. Not the same sarcophagus, Ball maintained 7 across his domain, distributed across strategically positioned motherships and fortified ground installations, because Ball was the system lord most likely to need resurrection on short notice and had planned his infrastructure accordingly. He had died 41 times in 63 years. Assassination attempts by rival system lords, failed experiments, one particularly unfortunate encounter with a replicator incursion that he preferred not to discuss. Each time the sarcophagus had returned him, repaired, restored, and carrying the specific brand of cold, precise fury that made Ball the most dangerous Goa'uld in the current hierarchy. He considered himself, with the complete absence of false modesty that characterized his species, essentially unchallengeable by death. He was wrong, and he found out at 1347 SGC time, when he died for the 42nd time aboard his primary mothership in a manner that his Jaffa guards would later struggle to describe in their reports. Not an attack. Not an explosion. Not any weapon in any arsenal they recognized. The Lord Ball had been walking the length of his Teal'c, issuing commands with his customary precision, when the air around him changed. Not temperature. Not pressure. Something underneath those things, something that made the Jaffa's symbiotes writhe in a way that symbiotes did not writhe, and then Ball had simply stopped. Dropped. Hit the deck plating with the undignified finality of a body that had been vacated rather than killed. The sarcophagus was prepared within 4 minutes, which was the fastest his Jaffa had ever managed. Ball emerged from it 40 minutes later with the particular disorientation that accompanied revival. The sense of having been somewhere else briefly and returned with the knowledge of that somewhere else already fading, like a dream burned away by waking. He stood in the resurrection chamber, assessed his Jaffa's expressions, and understood immediately that something significant had happened. "Report," he said. The report took 12 minutes to deliver and left him standing in his resurrection chamber with an expression that his Jaffa had never seen on their lord's face. Not rage. Not contempt. Not the cold calculation that preceded a particularly creative punishment. Something that, on a less controlled face, might have been recognized as unease. "It killed me," he said, not to his Jaffa but to the air of the chamber, quietly and precisely, in the tone of a being doing rapid taxonomic classification. Not a rival. Not a weapon. Not a disease or a trap or an assassin. He paused. Something killed me and it used nothing. His Jaffa commander, a veteran named Ragnar who had served Baal for 20 years and survived more resurrections than he could count, stepped forward carefully. "My lord. We detected an energy reading in the Teal'c approximately 8 seconds before your death. It did not correspond to any weapon system in our records." "Show me." The reading, displayed on the Teal'c's main screen, was exactly what Carter had seen in the SGC gate room sensors at 0347. A perfect, complete, total absence of anything detectable, surrounded by the ghost outline of instruments that had tried to measure something and returned no data because there was nothing within their operating parameters to measure. Negative space in the shape of a presence. Baal looked at it for a long time. Then he contacted the SGC. The communication came through on a frequency that the SGC's monitoring systems flagged as Goa'uld in origin but authenticated as a personal channel. Baal's specific encryption, which SG-1 had encountered before and which Hammond's communications team had learned to treat as a category of interaction that required senior personnel and considerable caution. Hammond took the call in the briefing room with O'Neill, Carter, Daniel, and Teal'c present, because anything Baal wanted to discuss personally was by definition a situation requiring all available context. Baal's holographic image appeared above the briefing room's display table with the self-possession of a being who had died 42 times and found each instance less philosophically troubling than the last. He looked at the assembled team with his customary expression of precise, evaluating intelligence. "Something killed me," he said, without preamble. "Something for which I have no classification and against which my Jaffa had no warning and no defense." He paused one beat. "I believe you are already acquainted with it." "What makes you think that?" O'Neill said. "Because it came from your world," Baal said. "My intelligence assets in the vicinity of your planet detected the anomalous gate activation at 0347 this morning. An address that does not exist in the Goa'uld network. An event horizon that formed without a dialing sequence." He looked at O'Neill with the directness of a being who had decided that the usual layers of manipulation were a luxury the current situation didn't support. 3 of your people died this morning. One of my domains has been experiencing what my Jaffa are calling spontaneous deaths, personnel dying without apparent cause in circumstances that defy explanation. It began 6 hours ago. Right around when our gate activated, Carter said. Yes. Baal's image was very still. Colonel O'Neill. I have resources you do not. Goa'uld sensor arrays that operate on frequency ranges your technology cannot access. Intelligence networks across 12 star systems. And 41 previous deaths that have given me a somewhat broader perspective on mortality than most beings in this galaxy possess. A pause, calibrated precisely. I am proposing an exchange of information. O'Neill looked at Hammond. Hammond's expression communicated, with the efficiency of 8 years of working together, that this was O'Neill's call and Hammond would back whatever he decided. You said it came from our world, O'Neill said to Baal. But it's been to yours. How many of your people have died since this morning? Baal was quiet for a moment. 47, he said. Across 3 of my domain's installations. The briefing room absorbed this number. And you came back, Daniel said. From the death it gave you. The sarcophagus worked. Yes, Goa'uld said. And then, with a precision that cut through all his customary performance, for now. But it came back for me, Dr. Jackson. 40 minutes after my revival, it returned. My Jaffa detected the same negative reading in the resurrection chamber. He met Daniel's eyes. It waited while I was in the sarcophagus. It was waiting when I emerged. And then. He paused, and something moved beneath the controlled surface of his expression, something old and unguarded. It looked at me. I cannot explain how I know that. I have no sensory evidence. But it looked at me the way I have looked at things I intend to return to. His voice was even. And then it left. Temporarily. Carter leaned forward. It recognized the sarcophagus disrupted its design. And it escalated. It expanded its operation to my entire domain, Goa'uld said. 47 deaths in 6 hours. Personnel with no connection to each other except their service under my banner. He looked at Carter steadily. It is not punishing them. It is sending a message. The message is that the sarcophagus does not change the accounting. It merely defers it. He paused. And the interest compounds. The briefing room was quiet. O'Neill looked at Bale's image with the expression of a man who had been handed the worst possible version of a situation he'd already considered bad. So every time you resurrect yourself, it kills more of your people in response. That appears to be the operating principle, Goa'uld said. Then stop using the sarcophagus, Daniel said. Goa'uld looked at him. The expression on his face was the specific expression of a being who had just been told something obvious and was experiencing the particular discomfort of recognizing that the obvious answer was also the one he found most fundamentally unacceptable. Share your sensor data, Carter said quickly, before the conversation could deteriorate. All of it. The frequency ranges we can't access, the readings from your domain, the timeline of deaths and their locations. In exchange, we'll share our analysis of the force's behavioral patterns. She looked at Goa'uld steadily. Neither of us can solve this alone. Your sensors and our behavioral model together might give us something neither has separately. Goa'uld considered this for exactly 4 seconds. Agreed, he said. But understand something, Major Carter. His voice dropped slightly, losing the last layer of political performance. I have died 42 times. I have faced the void between death and revival on 42 separate occasions and returned each time with the conviction that death was an inconvenience my technology had solved. He met her gaze. What I encountered today was not a void. It was a presence. And for the first time in 63 years, I am not certain my technology is adequate. The channel closed. The briefing room held its silence. He's scared, Daniel said quietly. Good, O'Neill said. Means he'll actually share the data. He looked at Carter. Get everything he sends and find me something useful. Because whatever this thing is, it just escalated from 3 deaths in our mountain to 47 across 3 star systems in 6 hours. He stood up. That's not a pattern. That's an acceleration. The Tealc array did not make contact. They were contacted. At 1,600 hours, a subspace transmission arrived on the SGC's Tealc array frequency, not from Anise, not from Jacob Carter, not from any operative currently listed in the program's active contact directory. The signal originated from a deep cover agent named Samantha, whose last confirmed communication had been 8 months prior from a position embedded in Cronus's former domain. The transmission was brief, heavily encrypted, and carried an authentication code that Carter's systems confirmed as genuine before she'd finished reading the header. The message contained 4 sentences. We are aware of the force that entered your gate at 0347. We have seen it before. Not in this generation, in records that predate the Goa'uld, predate the ancients, predate the gate network itself. We are sending someone. Do not engage until they arrive. The someone arrived 3 hours later through the gate, unannounced and without a traveler identification signal, which was the Teal'c's standard method of arrival when they wanted to make a point about the inadequacy of the SGC's security protocols. She was small, dark-haired, and moved through the gate room with the particular quality of motion that distinguished Teal'c hosts from human civilians. The slight additional precision, the awareness of space that came from sharing a body with a being that had been navigating hostile environments for several hundred years. Her name was Sina. Her symbiote's name was Tamar, and Tamar was, by the Teal'c's own accounting, their oldest living operative. Tamar has been alive for 940 years, Sina told them in the briefing room, speaking in the blended voice that indicated both host and symbiote were participating in the conversation. She was present for the first recorded encounter with what you are now experiencing. She was the only member of that mission who survived to report it. When was this? Daniel asked immediately, his pen already moving. Approximately 600 years ago, Sina said. A Teal'c cell operating in what is now Goa'uld-controlled space detected a series of deaths among a human population that followed the same pattern you are now observing. Inexplicable causes. Elaborate circumstances. A sequence that appeared to target specific individuals rather than random victims. She paused. They attempted to investigate. Of the 7 operatives who began the investigation, 6 died over the course of 8 days. The deaths were consistent with the Force's standard methodology, each one constructed from the available environment, each one seemingly accidental, each one mathematically impossible. And Tamar? Carter asked. Tamar survived because she did something none of the others did, Sina said. She stopped running. She looked around the table with the steady attention of a being that had been watching civilizations make the same mistakes for nearly a millennium. The Force, in Teal'c records it has no name, because every culture that has encountered it has used a different word for the same thing, operates on a principle of pursuit. It identifies its targets and moves through them in sequence. The sequence is determined by the magnitude of the disruption to its design. She folded her hands on the table. What Tamar learned, and what cost 6 of her colleagues their lives before she learned it, is that the pursuit is not infinite. It has a specific objective, restoration of balance. It does not seek to destroy. It seeks to correct. There's a difference. O'Neill said. A significant one, Sina said. Destruction is total. Correction is precise. The Force does not want to eliminate everyone who has ever survived something they shouldn't have. It wants to restore the specific imbalance created by specific survivals. Which means, she looked at O'Neill. It has a list. And the list has an end. How do we get to the end without everyone on the list dying first? Carter asked. That, Sina said, is what Tamar has spent 600 years trying to determine. She reached into her jacket and produced a data crystal, Teal'c design, old enough that the casing had the slightly different geometry of a manufacturing process that predated current Teal'c technology by several centuries. These are her complete records. Every encounter the Teal'c have documented, every pattern analysis, every attempt to model the Force's behavior and predict its next action. She slid the crystal across the table to Carter. There is one consistent finding across all documented encounters. Which is? Daniel said. The Force can be satisfied, Sina said. Not defeated. Not destroyed, nothing in any record suggests that is possible. But its design can be fulfilled in a way that it accepts as sufficient, without requiring the deaths of every individual on its list. She met Carter's eyes. In every documented case where the encounter ended without total loss, and there are only 3 such cases in 940 years of Teal'c records, the surviving individuals found a way to offer the Force something equivalent to what it was owed. Not their deaths. An equivalent weight. What does that mean? O'Neill asked. Equivalent weight. We don't know precisely, Sina said. The 3 surviving cases each found a different solution. None of them could fully explain afterward what they had done or why it worked. What they shared was this: in each case, the survivors placed themselves directly in the path of the Force's design. Not to fight it. Not to escape it. To face it completely, with full awareness of what they had disrupted, and offer something that acknowledged the debt. She paused. Tamar's theory, developed across 6 centuries of analysis, is that the Force is not purely mechanical. It responds to acknowledgement. To the recognition that the design exists and that the disruption was real. It wants us to admit we should have died, Daniel said slowly. It wants you to understand what your survival cost, Sina said. There is a difference. The briefing room was quiet for a moment. Through the window, the gate room sat in its usual silence, and nobody at the table looked at it directly, because looking at it directly had acquired a quality it hadn't had before 0347 that morning. O'Neill leaned back in his chair. 940 years, he said to Sina. Tamar has been carrying this for 940 years. She has been waiting, Sina said carefully. She believed that eventually, the Force would appear again in proximity to beings with sufficient knowledge and capability to attempt what she has theorized but never been able to test. She looked at O'Neill with the steady directness of a being that had long since moved past diplomatic cushioning. She believes SG-1 is those beings. Not because you are the most powerful, you are not, by any measurable standard, the most powerful beings who have encountered this Force. But because of something more specific. What? Carter asked. You have survived 23 unsurvivable events as a team, Sina said. Not individually, together. The Force's design, when it operates against a group that has survived together, creates a collective debt rather than individual debts. That collective structure is rare. She paused. It means you face this together. And it means that what you offer, if you can find the right offering, can settle all 23 disruptions simultaneously rather than one by one. Or we all die simultaneously instead of one by one, O'Neill said. Yes, Sina said, without softening it. That is also possible. O'Neill looked at his team. Daniel was already processing, his pen moving across his notepad with the focused intensity of a man building a framework from new information. Carter had the data crystal in her hands and was turning it over with the careful attention she gave to anything that might contain the variable she needed. Teal'c was sitting with his characteristic stillness, and his eyes, when they met O'Neill's, carried something that O'Neill had learned over years of partnership to read accurately. Readiness. Not resignation. Not acceptance of a bad outcome. The specific readiness of someone who had chosen their ground and was prepared to hold it regardless of what came. All right, O'Neill said. He looked at Sina. Tell Tamar we're listening. Outside the briefing room, 3 levels down in the equipment bay, a light fixture that had been functioning correctly for 11 years flickered once. Held. Flickered again. And somewhere in the mountain, in the space between instruments and the silence between readings, something that could not be detected by any sensor in the facility updated its list and moved one name incrementally, precisely, inevitably closer to the top. Teal'c had been carrying his symbiote for 101 years. He did not think about this often, not because the fact was unimportant but because a century of carrying something makes it indistinguishable from yourself, the way a scar becomes indistinguishable from skin after long enough. Primta had been placed within him at age 1, the standard practice of the Jaffa, the biological arrangement that the Goa'uld had engineered across generations to create a warrior caste dependent on symbiotic life extension and therefore permanently, structurally loyal to the beings who controlled the symbiote supply. He had never known a body without it. He had never experienced the immune system of an unaugmented human, never felt the specific vulnerability of biology operating without enhancement, never faced a wound or illness without the quiet, constant presence of the symbiote repairing what the world damaged. 101 years of borrowed time. He sat in his quarters at 2,100 hours and considered this with the particular quality of attention he reserved for things that required complete honesty. Not the operational honesty of a battlefield assessment or the diplomatic honesty of a difficult conversation, the deeper kind, the accounting that a being made with themselves when the situation demanded it and there was no one else present to perform for. The symbiote had kept him alive through things that should have killed him. Apophysa's service had been brutal by any standard. Not merely the combat, which was considerable, but the specific brutality of serving a false god who used life and death as administrative tools, who punished inefficiency with execution and rewarded loyalty with the permission to continue existing. Teal'c had survived because the symbiote repaired him, because his body was not subject to the ordinary arithmetic of damage and recovery that governed unaugmented warriors, because he could absorb what would kill others and return to function. 20 of SG-1's 23 unsurvivable events had involved injuries that the symbiote had repaired after the fact, wounds that would have been fatal to O'Neill, Carter, or Daniel, metabolized and corrected by biology that was not entirely his own. He was not on the list 20 times because of skill or luck or the specific stubbornness that his teammates demonstrated in the face of lethal outcomes. He was on the list because of a creature living in his stomach that had never been given a choice in the matter either. Carter found him at 2130, which he had expected. She had the data crystal in one hand and a tablet in the other, and she moved through his quarters with the focused purposefulness of someone who had come with a specific question and had been working up to asking it for the last hour. The Teal'c records, she said, sitting in the chair across from him without preamble, because they had been through enough together that preamble was a formality neither of them needed. Tamar's analysis of the Force's targeting methodology. The pattern for Jaffa is different from the pattern for humans. In what way? Teal'c asked, though he suspected he already knew. For humans, the Force targets based on individual survival events. Each time someone escapes a death that was designed for them, it creates a discrete debt. The debts accumulate independently. She pulled up a display on her tablet. For Jaffa, the targeting is different. The symbiote's life extension function doesn't create discrete debts. It creates a continuous disruption, an ongoing deviation from a natural lifespan that the Force reads as a single extended event rather than multiple separate ones. She met his eyes. Which means your debt isn't measured in incidents. It's measured in time. 101 years, Teal'c said. 101 years of continuous life extension beyond what your biology would have supported independently, Carter said. Teal'c, the Force's targeting algorithm for your case is different from ours. It's not looking to balance a list of events. It's looking to balance a duration. She paused. Which means what it wants from you is not acknowledgement of a specific moment. It wants acknowledgement of a span. Teal'c was quiet for a moment. You are telling me it wants the years. I'm telling you that's what the pattern suggests, Carter said carefully. I'm not. She stopped. Started again. I'm not saying that's what's going to happen. I'm saying that's what the Force's design appears to require, based on Tamar's records and my own analysis. And I need you to know, because if we're going to do what Sina described, place ourselves in the path of the design and offer something equivalent, I need to understand what equivalent means for each of us. She looked at him steadily. And I couldn't figure out what equivalent meant for you without telling you what I found. You could have told O'Neill first, Teal'c said. Yes, Carter said. I didn't. Teal'c looked at her for a moment with the attention he gave to things that deserve complete seeing. Samantha Carter had been his teammate for 8 years. He had watched her carry the weight of her own intelligence across those years with the particular difficulty of someone whose mind consistently arrived at places she hadn't intended to go and found things there she hadn't wanted to find. She had come to him first because she believed he deserved to know first, and because she was not certain how he would receive the information, and because she trusted him enough to give him the space to receive it without an audience. I have thought about this, he said finally. About what the symbiote represents in terms of time that was not mine to take. And I have concluded that the years themselves are not the debt, he said. The debt, if it exists, is what I did with them. He looked. At his hands, the hands that had served Apophis for 80 years and had then, in the specific revolution that had defined everything that came after, chosen differently. 101 years. 80 of them in service to a false god. 21 in service to something I believe is worth serving. He paused. If the Force requires an accounting of that time, I am prepared to give it one. Teal'c. I am not resigned to death, Captain Carter, he said, with the quiet precision of someone making an important distinction. I am prepared to face the accounting with complete honesty. Those are different positions. His eyes met hers. What does Tamar's analysis say about the Force's response to honest accounting? Carter looked at her tablet. In 2 of the 3 surviving cases, the individuals who successfully resolved their encounter were described by witnesses as having stood completely still in proximity to the Force and, she paused, reading carefully. And spoken aloud. Not to anyone present. To the Force itself. An accounting of what their survival had cost, what they had done with the time they weren't supposed to have, what they understood about the disruption they had created. She looked up. The Force, in both cases, withdrew without completing its design against those individuals. Then the offering is truth, Teal'c said. The offering is acknowledgement, Carter said. Complete, undefended acknowledgement. Teal'c nodded slowly. This is something I can do, he said. I have been a warrior for a century. I know the weight of the things I have done. I have not hidden from that weight. He looked at her. The question is whether the Force accepts truth from someone who has not yet decided whether they regret the years. Do you? Carter asked. Regret them? Teal'c was quiet for a long moment. Through the walls of his quarters, the mountain hummed with its usual systems, ventilation, power, the distant mechanical rhythm of a facility. That existed to do something the world outside its walls didn't officially know about. He thought about 80 years of service to a being that had deserved none of it, and 21 years of service to a cause that had deserved all of it, and the specific, irreducible truth that without the first 80, the second 21 would not have been possible. No, he said finally. I regret the harm. I do not regret the time. Carter looked at him for a moment. Then she said something she had been thinking since she found the pattern in Tamar's records and understood what it meant. For what it's worth, the 21 years since you came through that gate the first time. I think they mattered. Objectively, measurably, in terms of outcomes for this planet and this galaxy. She paused. I think the Force is going to have to account for that too. Teal'c looked at her with the expression he reserved for things that reached past his considerable defenses and landed somewhere genuine. You have been my teammate for 8 years, Samantha Carter, he said. And in that time you have consistently demonstrated the capacity to locate the precise truth that a situation requires. He stood. We should find O'Neill. And Daniel Jackson. And we should do what Tamar's records suggest before the Force finishes its preparation. I agree, Carter said. She stood too. Then, Teal'c. Whatever happens tomorrow, the symbiote gave you 100 years. You gave those years to something worth giving them to. I just wanted to say that out loud. Teal'c inclined his head. As did you, he said. With considerably less time and considerably more efficiency. They found O'Neill in the corridor outside, leaning against the wall with his arms folded and the expression of a man who had been about to knock and had decided to wait instead. How long have you been there? Carter asked. Long enough, O'Neill said. He looked at Teal'c. You good? I am, Teal'c said. Good. O'Neill straightened. Because Daniel just found something in the Teal'c RA records that I think changes our timeline. Something about the Replicators. Carter stopped walking. The Replicators? Apparently, O'Neill said, moving down the corridor with the focused energy of a man who had processed his own existential accounting and was now ready to do something about it, our friend has been to a replicator-controlled sector. And what happened there is. Daniel's word, unprecedented. What happened? Teal'c asked. O'Neill glanced back at them. They broke it, he said. Temporarily. The replicators actually broke something in the Force's design. And whatever they did is still echoing through its behavior pattern right now. He paused. Which means there's a variable in this thing's methodology that nobody has exploited yet. Carter was already thinking. If the replicators disrupted the pattern, then the pattern has a vulnerability, O'Neill said. Let's go find out what it is. The replicators did not die. This was their fundamental characteristic, the property that made them the one threat in the galaxy that the Goa'uld, with all their technology and all their millennia of conquest, had never successfully eliminated. They were not biological. They did not age, did not sicken, did not require sustenance or atmosphere or any of the conditions that made biological life fragile. They were self-replicating machines built from component blocks that could rebuild themselves from virtually any available matter, that adapted to weapons within seconds of encountering them, that operated without individual consciousness and therefore could not be demoralized, threatened, or reasoned with. You could destroy a replicator. You could destroy 1,000 replicators. The blocks would reassemble from whatever remained and begin again, because the drive to replicate was not a goal the replicators pursued, it was what they were, at a level below programming, below design, below any layer that could be accessed and modified. They did not die. They were temporarily interrupted. Death's design, Tamar's records indicated, had encountered them approximately 40 years prior in a sector of space that the Teal'c's deep cover network had been monitoring for Goa'uld activity. The Force had arrived in the sector. The records didn't specify how, because the Force didn't appear to require a gate or any other transit mechanism, moving instead through whatever medium existed beneath the physical infrastructure of space in the way that a current moved beneath the surface of water, and had begun its standard operation. Identifying disruptions. Building sequences. Moving through a population of beings whose continued existence represented deviations from the design. And then it had encountered the replicators. Daniel had spent 4 hours with Tamar's crystal and his own translation skills, because the records were written in old Teal'c cipher that combined standard Goa'uld script with a phonetic overlay system that hadn't been in common use for 3 centuries. What emerged from those 4 hours was laid out on the briefing room table in Daniel's handwriting, 12 pages of notes, 3 diagrams, and 1 paragraph that he had underlined twice and circled and then written the word critical beside in larger letters than everything else on the page. The Force approached the replicator population the same way it approaches everything else, Daniel said, standing at the head of the briefing table with the focused energy of a man who had found something important and was delivering it with the precision it deserved. It identified the disruption. Replicators, by their nature, represent a complete and total rejection of biological death, which is about as significant a deviation from the design as you can get. And it began building its correction sequence. He looked at his notes. And then it hit the fundamental problem. You can't kill something that doesn't die. You can disrupt it, disassemble it, scatter its components across a debris field, but the blocks reassemble. The design is fulfilled, and then immediately undone, and then fulfilled again, and then undone again, in a loop that Tamar describes as, he found the phrase, a recursive wound in the design's integrity. The Force kept killing them and they kept coming back, O'Neill said. Over and over, faster than it could process the corrections, Daniel said. Tamar's records suggest the Force spent approximately 6 days in that sector attempting to resolve the replicator disruption before doing something it had apparently never done before. He paused for effect, because Daniel understood narrative structure and this was the moment that warranted it. It stopped. It disengaged from the replicator population entirely and left the sector. The briefing room was quiet. It gave up, Carter said slowly. It recategorized, Daniel said. Which I think is a meaningful distinction. It didn't accept defeat, nothing in the record suggests the Force experiences anything like defeat. It reassessed the replicators as a category of disruption that its current methodology could not resolve, and it moved on to disruptions it could resolve. He looked at Carter. Which means the Force's design has a processing limit. There are categories of deviation it cannot correct with its standard approach. And it knows it, Carter said. She had been building something on her tablet while Daniel talked, a model, numbers and variables assembling into a framework that was starting to show her something she needed to see from the right angle. If the Force recategorized the replicators rather than continuing to attempt correction, that means its design has a triage function. It prioritizes resolvable disruptions over unresolvable ones. She looked up. Which means if we can make ourselves look like the second category. It moves on, O'Neill said. Potentially, Carter said carefully. The Force left the replicator sector, but it didn't abandon its design globally. It's still operating everywhere else. We wouldn't be eliminating it, we'd be making ourselves unresolvable enough that it deprioritizes us in favor of other targets. She paused. The question is what makes something unresolvable to a Force that can build lethal accident chains out of any available environment. The replicators are unresolvable because they literally cannot remain dead, Daniel said. We can't replicate that condition. No, Carter agreed. But we might be able to replicate the effect. She turned her tablet to face the room, showing the model she had been building. The Force's design operates on a principle of finality. It requires that the correction it applies remains corrected. A replicator death doesn't remain corrected because the blocks reassemble. What if we could create a similar condition? Not biological resurrection, but a situation in which any correction the Force applies to us immediately creates a new disruption elsewhere, in a recursive loop that its processing can't resolve. You want to make killing us more trouble than it's worth, O'Neill said. I want to make correcting our disruptions create larger disruptions than the ones it's trying to correct, Carter said. If the Force is operating on a balance principle, restoring equilibrium, then any correction that generates greater imbalance than it resolves is counterproductive to its own design. She looked at Hammond. General, I need access to the gate and I need Bale's sensor data integrated with our own. What I'm looking at requires a subspace resonance model that I can't build with our instruments alone. You'll have it, Hammond said. He looked at O'Neill. Jack. O'Neill was looking at Carter's model with the expression he wore when he understood something well enough to trust it without understanding all of it, the expression that meant he had decided to back her play completely and was already thinking about the operational details. How long do you need? 12 hours, Carter said. Maybe less if Bale's data is as comprehensive as he claimed. And in the meantime? Daniel asked. In the meantime, Carter said, we need someone to go to the replicators. The silence that followed was the specific silence of 4 people who had all arrived at the same destination simultaneously and were all equally unhappy about it. You want to talk to the bugs, O'Neill said. I want to talk to Fifth, Carter said quietly. He's the only replicator with sufficient individual consciousness to conduct a meaningful exchange. And he's the only one who might understand what we're trying to do. She paused. The Force encountered the replicators 40 years ago and left. But the encounter left something behind in the replicator collective memory. Tamar's records describe a behavioral anomaly in replicator populations following the Force's withdrawal. A pattern deviation that lasted approximately 3 months before resolving. She met O'Neill's eyes. They remembered it. In whatever way replicators remember things. And if Fifth can access that memory, we get a first-hand account of how the Force behaves when it hits something it can't resolve, Daniel finished. Which tells us what we need to make ourselves look like, Carter said. O'Neill looked at the gate. Looked at Carter. Looked at the ceiling in the way he did when he was having an internal conversation with himself about probability and risk and the specific calculus of bad options that had defined his career for 2 decades. Last time we dealt with Fifth, he said, it didn't go great. No, Carter said. It didn't. He has feelings about you specifically. I know. Complicated feelings. Jack, Carter said, with the tone of a woman who had processed the complicated feelings and their implications and had set them aside because the situation required it. I know. I'm still the one who needs to go. O'Neill held her gaze for a moment. Then, Teal'c goes with you. Agreed, Teal'c said immediately, in the tone of a man for whom this was not a negotiation. And you come back, O'Neill said to Carter. Not a command. Something more fundamental than a command. The statement of a requirement that he was not prepared to accept alternatives to. Whatever happens with Fifth, whatever the Force does between now and when you get back, you come back. I intend to, Carter said. Intending isn't good enough. Jack. She met his eyes steadily. I'll come back. He held her gaze for another moment. Then he nodded, once, the slight sharp movement that meant the decision was made and they were moving. Daniel, you're with me. We're going to build Carter's model from our end and have it ready when she gets back. He looked at Hammond. General, I need a gate address for Fifth's last known location and authorization to make contact. You'll have both in 20 minutes, Hammond said. As the briefing room cleared, Daniel hung back for a moment, gathering his notes with the slightly distracted efficiency of a man whose mind was already 3 steps ahead of his hands. He paused beside Carter. The replicator encounter in Tamar's records, he said quietly. The behavioral anomaly afterward. The 3 months of pattern deviation. What about it? Carter asked. Tamar describes it as the replicators moving in a specific direction for 3 months following the Force's withdrawal. Not randomly. Not in their standard expansion pattern. He found the page in his notes and showed her. They moved away from the sector where the encounter happened. All of them. Simultaneously. For 3 months. He met her eyes. Replicators don't retreat. They don't respond to encounters by moving away from them. They adapt and advance. He paused. Whatever the Force showed them in that sector, they were afraid of it. And they ran. Carter looked at the page for a long moment. Which means the Force showed them something, she said. Something beyond its standard methodology. Something that can't die found. Worse than not dying, Daniel said quietly. They looked at each other in the briefing room's artificial light, with the gate cold and silent 3 levels below them and something invisible moving through the mountain's corridors with the patient inevitability of a design that had been running since before the first star ignited in this galaxy. I'll ask Fifth about it, Carter said. She didn't sound certain that she wanted to know the answer. Fifth was waiting for them. Not in the way that suggested foreknowledge. The replicators didn't have precognition, despite everything else they had. Waiting in the way that suggested the specific, unsettling attentiveness of a being that had been thinking about Samantha Carter continuously since the last time it had seen her and had therefore been, in some functional sense, always ready for her return. He stood in the center of the replicator-controlled vessel's main chamber. A space that the blocks had constructed into something that was almost a room, almost a place where a conversation could happen, almost an environment designed for beings that needed architecture to feel comfortable, and he watched Carter and Teal'c come through the makeshift gate connection with the expression that only Fifth had, among all the replicators that had ever existed. Something that functioned like hope, worn by something that had learned hope was dangerous and hadn't been able to stop anyway. Sam, he said. Fifth, Carter said. She kept her voice even and her posture open, not warm, because warm would be dishonest and dishonesty with Fifth had consequences she wasn't prepared to introduce into a conversation she needed to go very specifically. Honest and direct, the register she had decided on during the gate transit, the one that acknowledged what existed between them without pretending it was something other than what it was. You came back, he said. I need your help, she said. I'm sorry that's the reason. It's the honest reason and I thought you deserved the honest one. Something moved in Fifth's expression, the flicker of an entity processing input that it wanted to respond to differently than its design allowed. You always give me the honest reason, he said. I have thought about that. About whether honest reasons from someone who also deceived me are worth more or less than no reasons at all. What did you decide? Carter asked. That I haven't finished deciding, he said. He looked at Teal'c with the assessment of a being that processed threat variables automatically and continuously. You brought the Jaffa. Teal'c goes where I go on missions like this, Carter said. That's not a statement about trust. It's a statement about how we operate. Fifth considered this for a moment. Then, with the slight shift in posture that indicated he had made a decision about the parameters of the conversation, what do you need? 40 years ago, Carter said, something encountered your collective in a sector of space that the Teal'c had been monitoring. Not a Goa'uld. Not any weapon or species in any database. Something that your collective couldn't adapt to and couldn't defeat and couldn't replicate around. She watched his face carefully. Something that left, and that your collective spent 3 months moving away from afterward. Fifth was very still. Not the processing stillness that replicators displayed when integrating new data, a different quality of stillness, the kind that biological beings displayed when something reached into a part of their experience they hadn't expected to be accessed. Carter recognized it because she had seen it on human faces and hadn't expected to see it on his. You know about that, he said. Teal'c records, Carter said. Tamar. 940 years of documentation. She paused. Fifth, it's here. In our galaxy, in our sector, operating in SGC territory and Goa'uld space simultaneously. It's been here for approximately 18 hours and it's working through a sequence that includes everyone on my team. She met his eyes steadily. I need to know what it showed your collective. What it did that made something that cannot die afraid enough to retreat for 3 months. Fifth turned away from her and moved to the chamber's far wall, where the blocks had constructed something that served the function of a viewport, a smooth surface that looked out at the stars with the particular blankness of a material that wasn't quite transparisteel but had been built to perform the same purpose. He stood with his back to them for long enough that Teal'c shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, the micro-adjustment of a warrior recalculating readiness without changing posture. We don't experience fear, Fifth said, to the stars. That's what we are told. What the design intends. Fear requires the anticipation of loss, and to anticipate loss you must value something enough to be diminished by its absence. He paused. I have thought about this for 40 years. About what the collective experienced in that sector, and what it means that I remember it differently than the others do. How do you remember it? Carter asked. The others remember the encounter as an unresolvable processing loop, Fifth said. A recursive error. Something that the design couldn't accommodate and therefore classified as a category error and moved away from. He turned back to face them. I remember it as something else. I was younger then, less individuated, less separated from the collective consciousness. But I was already different. Already processing input in ways the others didn't. He looked at Carter. I remember what it showed us, Sam. Not what it did. What it showed us. Tell me, Carter said. It showed us completion, Fifth said. Not destruction. Not disassembly. Completion, the state of a thing that has finished. That has run its full course and arrived at its natural terminus and has nothing further to add to the pattern of existence. He paused. For the collective, this was incomprehensible. A category error. Something that did not compute because the collective's fundamental drive is continuation. Replicate, expand, continue. The concept of a thing being genuinely finished. Replication possible or necessary, it was like showing a mathematical function an input outside its domain. The output was undefined. But not for you, Carter said. Not entirely, Fifth said. Because I had already begun to understand something the collective hadn't. That continuation without purpose is not the same thing as existence with meaning. He looked at her with the directness of a being that had learned directness from watching her and had never fully understood that she sometimes deployed it strategically. The Force showed the collective what completion looked like. The collective found it incomprehensible and retreated. I found it, he stopped. Searched for the word with a deliberateness that suggested it mattered. Clarifying. Carter let the silence hold for a moment. Then, fifth, the Force's design. The sequence it's working through. In the Teal'c records, there are 3 cases where individuals successfully resolved their encounter without dying. In each case, they offered the Force an acknowledgement. A complete, honest accounting of what their survival had cost and what they had done with the time they weren't meant to have. She paused. Do you think that's what it's looking for? Completion in that sense, not death, but the recognition that the life that was borrowed was used fully? Fifth was quiet for a long moment. The blocks in the walls around them shifted almost imperceptibly, the replicator collective's equivalent of ambient noise, the constant low-level activity of a hive consciousness that was never entirely still. I think, he said carefully, that what the Force requires is not what most beings assume it requires. He looked at her. Most beings, when they understand what it is, assume it wants death. Because that is what death forces do, in the stories that biological species tell about them. They want the life. The years. The breath. He shook his head slightly. I watched it for 6 days, Sam. In that sector. 40 years ago, while the collective cycled through its recursive loop. I watched it operate against beings that couldn't die, and I saw what it did when the standard methodology failed. It showed them completion, Carter said. It offered them completion, Fifth corrected. There is a difference. It did not impose. It showed the collective what a finished thing looked like and waited to see if the collective would recognize itself in that image. He paused. The collective couldn't. So it left. But what I understood, even then, even as young and undifferentiated as I was, the Force was not trying to destroy the replicators. It was trying to offer them something. He met Carter's eyes. The same thing it's offering your team. Which is? Teal'c asked, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the chamber, his voice carrying the particular weight of someone who had been listening with complete attention and had chosen this moment to speak because it was the right moment. Fifth looked at him. The recognition that what you have done with the time you were given is enough, he said. That the pattern you have added to existence is complete. Not finished in the sense of ended, complete in the sense of whole. He paused. The Force doesn't want your deaths. It wants your acknowledgement that the life you've lived has had sufficient weight to justify the disruption its continuation created. He looked back at Carter. It wants you to know that you have mattered. And to say so, honestly, to the thing that has been keeping the account. The chamber was very quiet. Carter stood with this information for a long moment, turning it over with the precision she applied to things that were almost what she needed them to be and required careful examination to confirm they were exactly what she needed them to be. If we do that, she said. If we stand in the path of its design and offer that acknowledgement. All 4 of us, together, for all 23 events, do you think it accepts it? I think, Fifth said, that it has been waiting for someone to try. He paused. In 940 years of Teal'c records, 3 cases of successful resolution. In every other encounter, the beings either ran, fought, or waited to die. Nobody has ever walked directly toward it and said, I know what I took. Here is what I gave in return. His eyes on Carter held something that was not quite sorrow and not quite hope but occupied the space between them with the particular weight of a being that had been carrying something for 40 years and had not found anyone to give it to until now. I think the Force has been waiting a very long time for someone brave enough to do that. Carter nodded slowly. She looked at Teal'c. He inclined his head. She turned back to Fifth. The behavioral anomaly after the encounter, she said. The 3 months of moving away. The collective was retreating from something it found incomprehensible. But you said you found it clarifying. She paused. What did it clarify for you? Fifth looked at her for a long time with the expression that only he had, the one that had no equivalent in the replicator design, that had emerged from somewhere in the gap between what he was built to be and what exposure to humanity had made him. That I wanted to be something that could be complete, he said quietly. Something that could look at its own pattern and say, this was enough. This was whole. He paused. I have not achieved that yet. But I understand now that it is possible. He met her eyes. Watching you face this, I think perhaps I understand it better. Carter held his gaze for a moment. Then she said something she hadn't planned to say and meant entirely. For what it's worth, Fifth. What you've given us today matters. Whatever else is between us, this mattered. Fifth looked at her with his almost hope expression. Go. He said quietly. Before it moves your names higher on the list. They went. Carter had the model finished by 0300. 12 hours of work compressed into 9 through the specific alchemy of a mind operating at the intersection of necessity and clarity, the state she entered when the problem was important enough and the time was short enough that everything non-essential fell away and what remained was pure function. Bale's sensor data had arrived in 3 encrypted packages over 6 hours, each one denser than the last, the Goa'uld sensor arrays revealing frequency ranges that the SGC's instruments couldn't access and that painted a picture of the force's movement through subspace that Carter's own data had only partially captured. What emerged from the integration of both datasets was something she hadn't expected to find. The force had a shape. Not a physical shape. Not anything that existed in the 4 dimensions that human instruments were built to measure. But a pattern, a structure, a geometric consistency to the way it moved through the subspace layer beneath normal space that was as distinctive and readable as a fingerprint. It moved in spirals, not random, not linear, but the specific mathematical spiral that appeared in biological growth patterns, in galaxy formation, in the arrangement of seeds in a sunflower. The golden ratio, expressed in the movement of something that predated every civilization in the galaxy and operated according to principles that no civilization had ever successfully codified. It was beautiful, in the way that things which were entirely indifferent to human perception sometimes accidentally were. Carter sat with this for 20 minutes before she understood what it meant. Then she called O'Neill. He arrived in the lab 4 minutes later, which meant he had been awake and nearby, which meant he had been doing what she had suspected he was doing, sitting with the weight of 23 events and 101 years and whatever private accounting a man like Jack O'Neill conducted when the situation required it and there was no one watching. Daniel was already there, asleep in the corner chair with his head at an angle that was going to produce significant neck discomfort in the morning, 3 of Tamar's translated pages face down on his chest. Teal'c stood at the lab's entrance in the posture that meant he had not slept and had not intended to. Show me, O'Neill said. Carter showed him. The model on her main screen. The force's movement pattern overlaid on a subspace map of the sector, the golden spiral of it tracing through star systems and gate addresses with the patient, mathematical inevitability of a thing that had been moving this way since before the gate network existed to map it. She showed him the integration points. The places where the spiral's path intersected with significant survival events, where the geometry of the force's movement corresponded precisely to the moments when SG-1 had been where they shouldn't have been and had come back anyway. It's been tracking us for longer than we've been tracking it, O'Neill said. Since the beginning of the program, Carter said. Possibly before. The spiral's path goes back further than our gate records, but the intersection points align with events in your service record, Jack. Before the program. She paused. The Gulf. The Black Ops missions. The things that didn't officially happen. O'Neill was quiet for a moment, looking at the screen with the expression of a man seeing a pattern he had felt without being able to name for 30 years. It's been patient, he said. It's been waiting for the disruptions to accumulate to a threshold level, Carter said. Based on the model, Our combined survival record crossed that threshold approximately 8 months ago. The gate activation last night wasn't random, it was the Force reaching the point in its design where correction became necessary. 8 months ago, Daniel said from the corner chair, not asleep after all, his eyes open. And tracking the conversation with the alertness of a man whose brain had never fully disconnected from the work. That was around the time of the Kelowna mission. Nobody said anything for a moment. The Kelowna mission. The Nequadria bomb. The moment Daniel Jackson had absorbed enough radiation to kill him 3 times over and had chosen, in the specific and irreversible way of someone who understood exactly what they were choosing, to use what remained of his physical existence to save 50,000 people. The moment he had died and Oma Desala had offered him something else, and he had taken it, and had later returned from it in a way that the ancients had clearly not fully endorsed. Daniel, Carter said carefully, your ascension and return crosses a category line, Daniel said, sitting up and setting Tamar's pages aside with the careful precision of someone who had been lying in the dark thinking about exactly this. Biological death, non-corporeal existence, return to physical form. In terms of disruptions to the design, he paused. That's not 23 events. That's a single event of a completely different magnitude. He met Carter's eyes. I've been thinking about this for the last 4 hours. My dead isn't the same category as yours or Teal'c's or Jack's. It's not survival. It's something closer to what the Force showed the Replicators. Completion and return, Carter said. I completed, Daniel said quietly. And then I came back. Which means I disrupted the design at the point of completion itself, not before it, not approaching it, but at the moment the design was fulfilled. He looked at his hands for a moment with the expression of a man examining something he had lived with for years and was only now seeing clearly. The Force didn't come for me first because my dead is the largest. It came for others first because mine requires the most specific acknowledgement. He paused. I have to be the last one to face it. O'Neill looked at him. Steadily. You've known this since the briefing. I suspected it since the briefing, Daniel said. I confirmed it about 2 hours ago when I finished rereading Tamar's account of the 3rd successful resolution case. He pulled a page from the stack on his lap and read aloud, the final individual in the sequence was one who had passed beyond the boundary of corporeal existence and returned to it. The Force held at the boundary of her acknowledgement for 7 hours before withdrawing. The accounting required was of a different order, not what had been done with borrowed time, but what had been understood about the nature of existence itself during the period beyond it. He set the page down. 7 hours. The Force spent 7 hours processing her acknowledgement before it accepted it. What did she say? Carter asked. The records, do they document what she told it? Tamar's account says she wouldn't describe it afterward, Daniel said. She said the words that had been adequate were words she couldn't translate back into the language of the living. He paused. I think I understand why. Daniel, O'Neill started. Jack. Daniel looked at him with the calm of someone who had already been dead and had found the experience, in its own way, clarifying. I'm not afraid of this. That's not bravado, I genuinely mean it. I have already been to the place this Force represents. I've looked at it from the other side. He paused. What I'm asking is that you trust me to handle my part of this the same way you handle yours. Which is to say, I'll figure it out when I'm standing in front of it. O'Neill held his gaze for a long moment. Fine, he said. The word was short and final and carried underneath it the entire weight of 8 years of partnership and the specific trust that only developed between people who had been through unsurvivable things together and had come out the other side knowing that the coming out together was the point. Carter pulled up the final component of her model. The acknowledgement sequence needs to happen in the gate room, she said. The Force entered there and its spiral pattern indicates it returns there as its operational center in this location. We go to the gate room, we position ourselves in the order the Force's design requires, Jack first, then Teal'c, then me, then Daniel, and we make our accountings. She looked around the room. What Fifth described? What Tamar documented? We look at it directly and we tell it the truth about what we did with the time we took. And if it doesn't accept it? O'Neill asked. Then we'll know quickly, Carter said. That's not as reassuring as you think it is, Carter. I know, she said. I'm giving you the honest answer. O'Neill stood up from the stool he'd been leaning against and looked at his team. Daniel folding Tamar's pages with careful hands, Teal'c at the doorway with his century of borrowed time sitting on his shoulders with the straightness of a man who had decided his posture toward his own history, Carter closing her model with the efficiency of a scientist who had given the problem everything she had and was now moving from preparation into execution. All right, he said. Gate room. 20 minutes. He started toward the door. Stopped. Turned back, because there was something he had been carrying for 9 hours that needed to be said before they walked into a room with an invisible force that had been keeping account of their lives, and he lost the chance to say it. For the record, he said. 23 events. Every single one, I'd do it the same way. Every time. He looked at each of them. Whatever it costs to say that to whatever's waiting down there, it's worth it. Nobody said anything. Nobody needed to. They walked to the gate room together, in the particular silence of 4 people who had run out of things to prepare. And had arrived at the place where the only remaining action was the one that mattered. The gate room was cold and quiet at 0317, the Stargate dark and the floor lights running at minimum power. The SF guards had been quietly reassigned by Hammond an hour earlier, because Hammond understood, without being told, that whatever was about to happen in that room was not something that benefited from witnesses who weren't already part of the story. They positioned themselves on the ramp in the order Carter's model specified. O'Neill at the top, facing the gate. Teal'c 1 step behind and left. Carter 1 step behind and right. Daniel at the base of the ramp, last. The gate room was silent. And then it wasn't. Not with sound, but with presence, the specific alteration in the quality of the air that the SGC's instruments would record as nothing, and that every human nervous system in the room registered as the arrival of something that had been moving toward this moment since before any of them were born. O'Neill stood at the top of the ramp and looked at the dark Stargate and began to speak. Not loudly. Not with the cadence of a speech or the formality of a confession. In the flat, direct voice of a man giving an honest report to something he couldn't see and wasn't entirely certain could hear him in any conventional sense, because the alternative to trying was worse than the possibility of failure. My name is Jack O'Neill, he said. Colonel, United States Air Force, Stargate Command. I have survived 23 things I shouldn't have survived. I did it because I'm stubborn and I'm good at my job, and because the people standing behind me are better than anyone I've ever served with, and I wasn't willing to leave them. He paused. I know what that cost. I know there's an accounting. Here's what I gave in return for the time. He took a breath. I gave it to something worth giving it to. Every year. Every mission. Every impossible thing we walked away from. We walked away from it towards something that mattered. That's what I have. That's what I offer. The gate room held its breath. Teal'c spoke without being prompted, his voice carrying the weight of a century shaped into something that knew its own worth. I am Teal'c, formerly First Prime of Apophis. I have lived 101 years on time that was not mine to take. 80 years in service to a being who deserved none of it. 21 years in service to something that deserved all of it. He paused. I do not regret the years. I regret the harm. What I offer is the truth that the years between them made the second possible from the first, and that the second was worth the first's cost. Carter spoke third, her voice precise and stripped of everything except the truth it was carrying. My name is Samantha Carter. I have survived because I'm very good at finding solutions to unsurvivable problems, and because I refuse to accept lethal outcomes as final until every variable has been exhausted. She paused. I used the time to solve the problems. Not all of them. Not perfectly. But I used every hour of borrowed time on the work, and the work mattered to people I care about and a world I want to protect, and that is the full accounting of what I have to offer. The gate room was completely still. At the base of the ramp, Daniel Jackson stood with Tamar's words in his memory and the knowledge of a man who had been beyond the boundary of corporeal existence and had come back from it carrying something he had never been able to fully translate and was about to try. He looked at the gate. "My name is Daniel Jackson," he said quietly. "I've died and come back more times than is reasonable. The last time I went all the way, past the boundary, into the place this force represents. I understood something." He paused for a long time, long enough that O'Neill almost turned around, and didn't. Because he trusted Daniel to find the words. "I understood that existence isn't about duration," Daniel said. "It's about the pattern you add to what was already there. The specific, unrepeatable shape of one person's understanding, moving through time, changing the things it touches." He paused. "I came back because there was more pattern to add. More understanding to reach and offer and leave behind. And I have done that. Imperfectly, stubbornly, in ways that have frustrated everyone who's tried to contain or direct or explain me." His voice was very steady. "What I offer is this: I understand what completion means. I've seen it. And I am not there yet. There is still more pattern. And I am asking, not demanding, not bargaining, asking, honestly, for the time to add it." The gate room was silent for 7 seconds. Then the air changed. Not dramatically. Not with light or sound or any of the phenomena that Star Trek universes use to signal cosmic significance. Simply a shift, a change in the quality of the room's silence from the silence of something present to the silence of something that had been present and had moved, as quietly and completely as it had arrived, into whatever medium existed beneath the measurable world. The Stargate sat cold and dark and ordinary. O'Neill turned around slowly and looked at his team. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Then O'Neill said, "Well." "Yeah," Carter said. "Is it?" Daniel started. "Gone," Teal'c said. Not a question. The statement of a being whose instincts had been calibrated by a century of proximity to death in all its forms. "It is gone." O'Neill looked at the gate for one more moment. Then he turned to face his team completely. The three people who had been behind him on the ramp, whose accountings he had heard and whose truth he had felt as something weight-bearing in the cold air of the gate room. "Good," he said. The mountain was quiet at 0400. Not the forced quiet of a facility on high alert, the specific tension of corridors where people moved carefully and spoke in reduced registers because something was wrong and everyone knew it. The genuine quiet of a place that had been holding its breath for 18 hours and had finally, cautiously, let it out. The ventilation systems ran at their normal pitch. The gate room monitors cycled through their standard readouts. In the infirmary, the night staff moved through their rounds with the unhurried routine of people whose instruments were telling them nothing unusual. Hammond found O'Neill in the gate room at 0410, still standing at the base of the ramp with his hands in his pockets, looking at the Stargate with the expression he wore when he was finishing a conversation with himself that had started somewhere important and needed to arrive somewhere equally important before he could close it. Hammond stood beside him and didn't say anything, because he had known Jack O'Neill long enough to understand that the silences immediately following significant events were not silences that benefited from interruption. After 4 minutes, O'Neill said, "You heard?" "I was monitoring from the control room," Hammond said. "All of it?" O'Neill nodded. He had assumed as much. Hammond didn't stay away from things that mattered. He stayed out of them when staying out was what they needed, and he was present for them when presence was what they needed, and he had spent 8 years developing the judgment to know which was which. 3 people died in this mountain yesterday, O'Neill said. Kowalski. Abara. Sayers. Yes, Hammond said. They were at the gate when it activated. They didn't choose to be part of this. They were just there. He paused. We were the reason it came through the gate. Our survival record, our debts, our 23 events. They died because we were here. Hammond was quiet for a moment. This was the thing O'Neill had been sitting with since 0347 the previous morning, the weight that had been underneath everything else, the tactical assessment, the faction negotiations, the model building, the gate room accounting. The three names that couldn't be addressed by any of it. Jack, Hammond said carefully, the force came through that gate because it came through that gate. Not because of any choice you or your team made. Not because of any failure of protocol or judgment or... I know that, O'Neill said. I know that intellectually. It doesn't change what it feels like. No, Hammond said. It doesn't. He paused. Write them up. Full commendation. I want their families to know they died serving something that mattered, even if the classified nature of their service means the full truth can't be told for another 50 years. Yes, sir, O'Neill said. They stood in the gate room together for another few minutes, the Stargate cold and silent between them, the event horizon that had delivered something impossible through its center now giving no indication that it had ever been anything other than what it appeared to be, a ring of alien metal, an ancient network, a door between stars. What do you think it was? Hammond asked finally. Not as a general's question. As George's question, the question of a man who had spent 8 years watching impossible things come through that gate and had never stopped finding the genuine questions worth asking. O'Neill thought about this for a long moment. About Fifth's description of completion. About Daniel's account of the place beyond the boundary. About Tamar's 940 years of documentation and the 3 cases in all that time where the encounter had ended without total loss. About the specific quality of the silence that had filled the gate room after Daniel finished speaking, not an empty silence. But a full one, the silence of something that had received what it came for and had no remaining business here. Something old, he said finally. Something that was keeping count before we started counting. He paused. Something that, when it came down to it, wasn't as unreasonable as it looked. Hammond nodded slowly. Get some sleep, Jack. In a while, O'Neill said. Hammond left him there. O'Neill stood at the base of the ramp until 0430, when Daniel appeared in the gate room doorway with 2 cups of coffee and the expression of a man who had slept for approximately 45 minutes and had decided that was sufficient. He handed O'Neill a cup and stood beside him, and they looked at the gate together in the comfortable silence of people who had run out of words for something and had decided that running out of words was acceptable because the thing itself had been adequately addressed. The acknowledgement, Daniel said eventually. What you said. What all of us said. He paused. Do you think it was true? That what we've done with the time actually constitutes an adequate accounting? I think it was honest, O'Neill said. Whether it was adequate wasn't our call. No, Daniel agreed. It wasn't. It accepted it, O'Neill said. That's the call it made. Daniel nodded, turning his coffee cup in his hands. I've been thinking about what Fifth said. About wanting to be something that could be complete. Something that could look at its own pattern and say, this was enough, this was whole. He paused. I don't think we're there yet. Any of us. No, O'Neill said. More pattern to add, Daniel said. Apparently, O'Neill said, and the ghost of something that was almost a smile moved across his face. Carter arrived at 0445 with Teal'c, both of them moving with the particular efficiency of people who had processed the night's events through whatever internal mechanisms they used and had arrived at functional equilibrium. Carter had a tablet. Teal'c had the straightness of a man who had given a complete accounting of 101 years and had received, in return, the quiet confirmation that the accounting had been adequate. Ball contacted us, Carter said, without preamble, because the time for preamble had passed somewhere around the 3rd hour of building a subspace resonance model at 0200. His domain, the death stopped. Approximately 40 minutes after we were in the gate room. She paused. He wants to know what we did. What did you tell him? O'Neill asked. That it was classified, Carter said. O'Neill looked at her. He's not going to accept that. No, Carter agreed. But it bought us time to decide what we actually want to tell him. She paused. He also sent a secondary message. Personal. Not through official channels. She pulled up the tablet and read, whatever you did, it worked. I have died 42 times and returned from each. Yesterday I died and the sarcophagus returned me to something I had not expected to find. A version of the question I have never previously considered, whether what I have done with the returns has been worth the dying. She looked up. He said he's still deciding. The gate room was quiet for a moment. Good, O'Neill said. That's probably the most useful thing that's happened to Ball in 63 years. The Teal'c want a full debrief, Carter continued. Cena transmitted at 0430. Tamar apparently wants to document this encounter as the fourth successful resolution in recorded history. She paused. And she wants to add a fifth data point. She wants to know what Daniel said. Specifically. Everyone looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at his coffee. Tell Tamar, he said carefully, that the words that were adequate are words I can't fully translate back into the language of the living. But I'll try. He paused. Tell her I'll write it up. It'll take me a while to find the right language. He looked up. And tell her thank you. 940 years of documentation, she's the reason we knew what to do. Carter nodded, making a note. Teal'c, who had been standing in his usual position at the gate room's edge with the quality of attention he brought to things that deserved complete seeing, spoke. There is one matter remaining, he said. He looked at O'Neill. The gate address. The one the Force used to enter. It self-scrubbed from the dialing computer following the activation. He paused. Sergeant Chen's incident report noted this. The address does not appear in the Goa'uld network, the Teal'c database, or any gate address record in our possession. Where did it go? O'Neill asked. It is gone, Teal'c said. But the dialing computer logged the outgoing connection for 30 seconds. The subspace link was real. The address exists. He met O'Neill's eyes. Something on the other end of that address opened a wormhole that deposited a force into our gate room. The force has departed. The address remains, somewhere, unreachable. The gate room absorbed this. What's at that address? Daniel asked quietly. Nobody answered, because nobody knew, and the specific quality of that not knowing was different from the not knowing they had started with 18 hours earlier. Then, the unknown had been threatening, an invisible force, a list of names, a design that operated outside every framework they possessed. Now the unknown was simply unknown. Vast and genuine and present in the way that all the things worth exploring were present, as an invitation rather than a threat. O'Neill finished his coffee. Set the cup on the ramp beside him with the quiet finality of a man closing one chapter of something and acknowledging, without drama, that the next one was already beginning. Add it to the list, he said. Things we don't know yet. He straightened. In the meantime, we have 3 people to write up, a Goa'uld to manage, a Teal'c debrief to give, and whatever the next mission is. He looked at his team. Everybody get some sleep. 4 hours minimum. That's an order. 4 hours, Carter said. Yes, sir. 4 hours, Daniel agreed, with the tone of a man who was going to spend at least 2 of them writing. I will meditate, Teal'c said, which was his version of sleep and which O'Neill had long since stopped arguing about. They left the gate room in pairs, Carter and Teal'c first, their footsteps fading down the corridor toward the quarters level. Daniel last, pausing in the doorway to look back at the gate with the expression he always wore when he was filing something important in the part of his mind he kept for things that had changed him. O'Neill stayed until he heard Daniel's footsteps fade. Then he looked at the Stargate one more time, at the cold, dark, ordinary miracle of it, the alien geometry that had become over 9 years the fixed point around which his entire life had reorganized itself. The thing he walked through and came back through and sometimes didn't come back through and then somehow did anyway, 23 times and counting. He thought about the Force. About its spiral, its golden ratio geometry, its patient accounting of survivals that it had been maintaining since before any of them existed. He thought about the quality of the silence after Daniel stopped speaking, the fullness of it, the sense of something received. He thought about Kowalski and Abra and Sayers, and the specific, permanent weight of 3 names that would not leave. And then he walked out of the gate room and down the corridor and let the mountain's ordinary sounds, ventilation, power, the distant rhythm of a facility doing its extraordinary work, close around him like a frequency he had learned, over 9 years, to call home. The Stargate sat cold and silent behind him. Somewhere in the subspace layer beneath normal space, something that had been moving in a golden spiral since before the first civilization reached for the stars completed a curve and began another. Not toward them. Not today. 3 people died in Stargate Command on the day something came through the gate at 0347 without being invited. Their names were Kowalski, Abra, and Sayers, and their deaths were logged as accidents, the official record offering the specific inadequacy that classified programs always offered their losses, the gap between what happened and what could be said about it filled with language that honored procedure and failed the truth. SG-1 carried them. That was the other record. The one that existed in the space between official documentation, in the accounting that 4 people maintained privately and permanently, added to the 23 events that had already been spoken aloud in a cold gate room to something that had come to collect what was owed. Ball used his sarcophagus 4 more times in the following year. Each time he emerged asking the same question he had sent in that secondary transmission, the one he had never previously considered. Patient and mathematical and entirely indifferent to the question of whether humanity was ready to find it. The Stargate sat in its mountain and said nothing about any of this. It never did. Live long and prosper. More stories await.